My ex-mother-in-law asks to sleep at my house after celebrating that I was no longer part of her family, but I say no and go to bed warm while she spends the night outside my door. I've been visiting Reddit for a while, reading stories about complicated divorces, families meddling in relationships, and other pretty unpleasant situations, and I must say I felt lucky that my divorce at least wasn't like that. Well, it wasn't until my ex-mother-in-law came into the picture. I'm 30 years old and in the middle of a divorce from my ex-husband, who is 32. Honestly, the separation has been more amicable than most people might imagine. After 7 years together, we simply realized we weren't the couple we used to be. There was no devastating infidelity, no emotional betrayal, not even constant arguments over small things. It was more of a slow, painful realization that we had grown in opposite directions. I wanted to focus on my career, explore my passions, maybe travel more. He, on the other hand, had settled into a stable job that didn't make him particularly happy and preferred a quieter life. In the end, we were in the same physical space but emotionally in entirely different universes. We had several conversations about it. At first, they were tense with tears on both sides, but we eventually came to a consensus. We weren't the right people to continue a life together. We loved each other, but that love had changed. It wasn't enough to keep us together in a relationship that neither of us felt fulfilled in. It was a painful but mature decision, and although separations always have their complications, we were handling it as best as possible. No yelling, no resentment. At least between the two of us. Now this is where things start to go sideways. Although we were separated, I decided to let my ex-husband stay at the house a little longer. To give some context, the house where we lived was mine before we got married. I bought it with my savings when I was 24. A small but charming house in a quiet neighborhood. Legally, he had no right to it, something we both recognized from the beginning. But, as I mentioned, we weren't on bad terms, and he had just started a new job recently, so he hadn't found a suitable place to move into yet. I offered to let him stay in the guest room while he found his own space. I didn't mind, really. I knew he would eventually leave and there was no rush. He was also actively looking for an apartment, and as soon as he found one, he would leave without any issues. Everything seemed to be going well until his mother got involved. My ex-mother-in-law has always been quite annoying, to put it mildly. From day one, I never had a good relationship with her. It wasn't that there was any specific event that triggered her dislike of me, but from the moment we met, I noticed her cold, distant attitude, and over time that feeling towards me became more obvious and direct. To help you understand the type of person we're dealing with, let me share an anecdote. Recently, it was my birthday, and my ex-mother-in-law called to congratulate me. At first, I thought she might be trying to be nice, which surprised me. But of course it couldn't be that simple. Instead of congratulating me, what she said was, "You know, I'm so glad you're not my daughter-in-law anymore. Now I don't have to buy you a birthday gift or feel obligated to spend money on someone who isn't worth it." The truth is, I never really understood why she hated me so much. We never had a serious argument or anything that could justify such a level of contempt. Maybe it was jealousy, or perhaps it was because my father was Latino. My mother is American, so my skin is quite light, but she might have had an issue with my father's background. She never made any openly racist comments, though who knows, maybe she hides it to avoid looking like the bad guy. Anyway, that call is a clear example of her hatred toward me, and there have been worse things while we were still together. For instance, once we visited her home, and when she saw us, she asked if I would be staying in a hotel because there wasn't much room in her house for the three of us. It was funny because she was pretending that I should leave my husband and go to a hotel during our stay in her city. However, my husband said that if I had to go to a hotel, he would go with me. So my ex-mother-in-law had to accept me staying there, though she certainly wasn't the best hostess one could expect. Fortunately, my ex-mother-in-law lived in a city quite far from us, which limited our interactions. I only saw her on occasional visits or when she came to visit us, and believe me, I was always happy when she left. However, even though she didn't live nearby, she always found a way to make my life a bit more difficult. For example, one of the few times she stayed at our house, something happened that still bothers me to this day. She had come to stay for a weekend because she supposedly had things to take care of in our city. At first, I acted like a good host, despite how uncomfortable I felt with her around. I prepared her guest room and made sure everything was ready for her arrival. The first day was relatively calm, though filled with small passive-aggressive comments, something I was already used to. However, on the second day, things really went downhill. While I was in a work meeting from home, back then I was working remotely, she decided to make some changes to the living room decor. When I finally left my makeshift office and walked into the living room, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She had rearranged the furniture, put some of my favorite plants in the closet because they were taking up too much space, And worst of all, she had removed the photos of my family from a shelf and replaced them with portraits of her, her husband, and my ex-husband as a child. For context, my ex-husband's father had passed away. When I confronted her, her response was that she thought the living room looked better, and that she preferred how she had arranged things over the previous decor. Honestly, I had to take several minutes to calm down before telling her that it wasn't her decision, and that she couldn't do whatever she wanted in my house. Of course, she didn't apologize, and the only thing she said was that she thought my decor was boring and she was just trying to help. After that weekend, I made it clear to my ex-husband that his mother was not welcome in our home without my prior permission, and for a while things were relatively calm on that front. But of course, the divorce has brought about all sorts of unexpected complications, and now once again I have to deal with my ex-mother-in-law. A few days ago, my ex-mother-in-law had been trying to get in touch with her son to talk about something related to a medical procedure she needed to have done in our city. My ex-husband was at work, and as usual couldn't answer the phone, so she decided to call me instead. From the moment I answered, the conversation started unpleasantly. Without even saying hello, her first comment was something like, "Why doesn't he answer the phone when I call? It seems he's always busy when it comes to me." That already put me in a bad mood, but I tried to stay composed. I explained that her son was at work and probably hadn't been able to answer her call. Then she surprised me with what she said next. Instead of asking, she informed me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that she planned to spend a night at our house because she had to undergo a medical procedure in the city and didn't want to drive afterward. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't asking, she was telling me, as if she had some sort of right over my house. I asked her why she didn't stay in a hotel, fully knowing that both she and my ex-husband could afford it without any issues. After all, it wasn't a major procedure, nor something that would leave her bedridden for days. Even if she wanted to stay for several days, it would be much more reasonable for her to stay somewhere other than my house, considering that she no longer had any relationship with me. Her response was that she didn't want to spend money on a hotel when her son lived in the city, and staying with him made the most sense. I clearly told her that she was no longer invited to stay at my house and that, in fact, the house didn't belong to her son. He was only staying in the guest room because I was allowing it while he looked for a new place to live. She started to protest, saying that it wasn't necessary to ask me, and that as long as her son was okay with it, that should be enough. Her argument was that if he was living there, then he had the right to receive guests without needing to consult me. I explained once again that this wasn't the case. That even though he was temporarily staying in my house, the property still belonged to me, and therefore I had the final say on who stayed or didn't stay. And since we were no longer family, I didn't have to accept her staying here, so the answer was no. She finally hung up the phone, visibly upset. A few hours later, I got a call from my ex-husband. He was angry because, according to him, there was no reason why his mother shouldn't be able to stay with us for a night. He said it wasn't fair to make her spend money on a hotel when the solution was so simple. I calmly reminded him that the house was mine, and if he wanted to have his mother over, it would be better if he sped up his search for a new place to live. That way, he could invite her to stay as long as she wanted without needing to ask me. And here I am, wondering if I was too harsh in responding the way I did. Should I have been more understanding and allowed his mother to stay for one night? Or did I do the right thing by setting boundaries now that our relationship is over? What do you all think? Update 1. My ex-mother-in-law had her procedure yesterday, and as you can imagine, I'm here to tell you what happened. Honestly, I didn't think I'd need to write about this situation again. After all, in my last post, most of you supported me, saying I wasn't the bad guy and that I had every right to decide who stays in my house. I thought everything was settled, but unfortunately, what happened yesterday was so surreal that I just have to share it. After my first post, I spoke with my ex-husband that same night. It was a relatively calm conversation, though he was still a bit upset that I hadn't let his mother stay, but in the end, we reached an understanding. I explained that it wasn't anything personal against him, but I simply didn't want his mother in my house after everything that had happened. To my surprise, he finally understood. He said he would talk to her and find a solution so she wouldn't have to stay at our place. I thought everything was resolved. He called his mother that night and told her she couldn't stay at my house. Obviously, she didn't take it well. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but he told me afterward that she said some pretty nasty things about me, which didn't surprise me in the least. Among the things she said, she called me bossy and claimed I was giving him orders. She also said that she had always felt like I was manipulating him. Despite everything, my ex stood firm and told her she would have to find somewhere else to stay. She ended the call furious, saying something like, "Thanks for nothing," before hanging up. Last night, just when I thought the day was over and I wouldn't have to think about this issue anymore, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, there she was, my ex-mother-in-law, standing with a suitcase in hand. My first reaction was pure disbelief. She looked at me and without wasting time told me she was there to stay. According to her, she hadn't been able to find a hotel for the night, and therefore had no other choice. I asked her why she hadn't booked a hotel before coming to the city, and her answer was one of those justifications that make no sense. She thought she'd find one after her procedure, but apparently couldn't. Honestly, I didn't believe her. I live in a fairly large city, and it's hard to believe all the hotels were fully booked unless there was a major event in town. But, of course, she insisted that there wasn't a single place available. When I suggested that maybe she should have rescheduled her procedure if she didn't have a place to stay, she got offended. She told me it was too late to drive back home and that it was only one night, as if that should make me change my mind. But honestly, I felt like she was trying to manipulate me. I calmly reminded her that I had been clear that she couldn't stay here, and that she should find another place for the night. That's when she started to get dramatic. She said she was going to call her son and tell him that I was willing to let a poor elderly woman, yes, she referred to herself as elderly, even though she's 57, which definitely doesn't make her elderly, sleep in her car. She also said that when she spoke to him, he would have no choice but to let her stay because she would cry over the phone and tell him she had nowhere else to go, and that it was too late to find another solution. I told her that if she wanted to call him, she should go ahead. I didn't mind. I was completely sure he wasn't going to change his mind after the conversation we had. What happened next was unexpected. Instead of calling him right away, she asked if she could come in to talk. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. If I let her in, it would have been 1,000 times harder to get her out of my house, and I wasn't going to fall for that. So I told her no and simply closed the door in her face. I stayed by the door listening to what she was doing. It didn't take long before I heard her calling my ex-husband. After a while, I got a call from him. He told me he had already spoken to his mother and had found a hotel room for her. He asked her to go directly there and gave her all the directions. I sighed in relief, thinking everything was finally resolved. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw she was still there, standing at the entrance with her suitcase. She didn't seem to have any intention of leaving, which made me wonder if she had really listened to her son, or if she just didn't want to accept the solution he had given her. An hour went by. An entire hour with her standing at my door without moving. I got another call from my ex, this time a bit worried. He said his mother hadn't arrived at the hotel, and he was starting to think something had happened to her on the way. I explained that, in fact, she was still standing at my door. He was shocked and asked me to hand her the phone so he could talk to her directly. Resigned, I opened the door and told my ex-mother-in-law that her son wanted to talk to her. I handed her my phone, though I wasn't thrilled about having to listen to the conversation, but I stayed outside because I needed my phone back. I heard their discussion, and as expected, she kept insisting she didn't want to go to the hotel. She said something about hotels being dirty and not trusting who had slept there before. She also mentioned that she wasn't sure if they changed the sheets. She finally hung up mid-complaint. I asked for my phone back, and just as she returned it to me, she looked at me and said that her son had told her she could come in. Obviously, I didn't believe her. I knew she was lying, and the worst part was that she seemed convinced I would fall for it. Not long after, I got another call from my ex-husband. He told me he was on his way to my house to pick up his mother, but he was quite far and would probably take a while to get there. I told him it was fine, but that his mother wasn't going to set foot inside my house under any circumstances. If she wanted to wait, she could do so in her car, but she wasn't spending another minute at my door. While waiting for him to arrive, I ordered food. Honestly, I didn't want to keep dealing with the situation and needed a distraction. But when the delivery driver arrived, my ex-mother-in-law was still standing at the door with her suitcase next to her, like she was waiting to come in. The situation was so strange and surreal, and the delivery guy seemed to think so too, because he kept glancing at her. She just wouldn't move. Finally, my ex-husband arrived. He approached his mother, and though I couldn't hear everything they said, I saw them arguing. She kept insisting she didn't want to go to the hotel, but after a while, he managed to convince her to get in the car. I watched them drive away and felt a huge sense of relief. Later that night, he returned and told me that he had successfully dropped her off at the hotel, although according to him, it took quite a bit of convincing. He also mentioned that the hotel hadn't been cheap. To be honest, the whole situation seemed a bit creepy to me. Imagining that someone would be willing to stand outside a house for hours just because they didn't want to accept a no as an answer. At one point, while waiting for her to leave, I had this mental image of her standing there all night, and in the morning when the newspaper boy came by, he would throw the paper and hit her. Of course, I don't get the newspaper delivered in print, but I probably would have paid for it for a day. Obviously, that's a joke before anyone asks, how could you do that? Update 2. Many of you were surprised that I didn't call the police when my ex-mother-in-law stood outside my house for hours during the last update. I understand the point, but honestly, there was no sense in doing so. She wasn't doing anything illegal. She was standing on the sidewalk, and as long as she didn't try to attack me, break in, or steal my food, which would definitely be a serious crime in my book, there wasn't really any justification to call the police. In the end, the one who suffered the most in that situation was her, staying outside in the cold for hours, not me. She made her choice and I made mine. If anything, you could argue she punished herself. Also, here's something curious I want to share. My ex-mother-in-law seems to enjoy being outside, so much so that she's done it again, this time staying out the whole night. After the previous incident, I thought I wouldn't see her again, at least not anytime soon. After all, after that first episode when my ex-husband took her to a hotel, she seemed to disappear from my radar. No messages, no calls, no unexpected visits, which gave me some peace. However, apparently, she had another medical procedure scheduled for 2 nights ago. The thing is, she picked the worst day to do it because my ex was out of town. He had a last-minute business trip. He mentioned it to me in passing, and I didn't think much of it until I saw his mother at my door again, apparently fresh from the procedure. I'm going to be completely honest here. I'm starting to believe these procedures are made up. I'm not sure if she's really undergoing any medical treatment, or just using it as an excuse to manipulate us. But what happened 2 nights ago was exactly the same as last time. She showed up with her suitcase saying she had nowhere to stay, couldn't find a hotel, and couldn't return to her city that night. You know the script. This time I was even more direct. I told her that her son wasn't in town and that if she needed a place to stay, her best bet was to go to the hotel she stayed in last time. I made it clear once again that she wasn't staying at my house. I wasn't in the mood for long conversations or arguments. I just said no and closed the door. After that, I called my ex-husband to tell him what was going on. As always, he tried to calm the situation down. He told me not to worry, that he would handle it as best as he could. I knew he couldn't do much from where he was, but I appreciated the effort. The truth is, I had no interest in dealing with her anymore that night, so I had dinner, watched a movie, and went to sleep. I didn't order takeout this time, mainly because I was afraid she might steal it. Honestly, she looked hungry. But jokes aside, I still had leftovers from the night before, and they were my favorite. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing I saw was my ex-mother-in-law's car still parked in front of my house. And there she was sleeping inside the car. My ex wasn't able to convince her to go anywhere else. I just went about my day as if nothing happened. I went to work, did my thing, and when I got back she was gone. Honestly, as long as she doesn't interfere with me directly, I don't really mind her being parked outside. At the end of the day, it's kind of like having free private security. If someone wanted to break into my house, I'm pretty sure they'd think twice if they saw a woman parked at the entrance, seemingly on guard all night. Jokes aside, what really worries me is how far she's willing to go. I know she's manipulative, and while for now she's just been making these uncomfortable visits, I can't help but wonder what her next move will be. That said, the only thing I ask is that she doesn't try anything more drastic, because then I'd be forced to take more serious action. I don't want to have to go that route, but if she keeps pushing like this, it might be my only option. For now, I can laugh a little at how surreal this all is, but we'll see what happens next time she decides to pay me a surprise visit. Update 3. I'm now officially divorced from my ex-husband. It's no surprise to anyone. It was just a matter of the paperwork making it official. I'm not here to talk about the divorce, because that had already been decided long ago. What I want to share is more about my ex-mother-in-law's behavior, and although she hasn't tried anything with me since the last incident at my door, it seems she's found a new target, my ex-husband. Not long after my last update, my ex finally found a place to live, which solved the problem of my ex-mother-in-law, especially after those medical procedures she supposedly needed, which, let's be honest, were more than just an excuse to try to stay at my house. The first procedure might have been real, but the second was clearly just a strategy to avoid ever leaving my house. And how do I know? Well, because that's exactly what she's doing to my ex-husband now. Here's how it goes. My ex-mother-in-law lived in a rental house, and apparently, the landlord decided to sell it. He gave her the option to buy it before putting it on the market, but since she couldn't or didn't want to pay for it, she had to find a new place to live. This is where things get interesting. She obviously tried to live with me, which, as we all know, didn't work. So instead she moved in with my ex. Yes, my ex-husband is now living with his mother. The reason my ex gave me was that his mother wanted to move to the big city, which doesn't surprise me at all. It's a great idea for her, of course. For me, it would have been a nightmare. So, I'm relieved to have gotten out of that situation before all this happened. Now, that problem is my ex's. I'm not exactly sure what arrangement they've come to, but if you ask me, I don't think it's a positive one for my ex living with his mother, a woman who clearly knows how to manipulate others and who, at one point, tried to force her way into my life. Doesn't sound like an ideal situation at all. Update 4. I think I mentioned at one point that the arrangement between my ex and his mother wouldn't be favorable for him, and it turns out I wasn't wrong. Yesterday, after 6 months of not hearing much about them, my ex called to tell me what's been going on. Honestly, I had completely forgotten about these posts until he called. He told me that he had finally gotten tired of living with his mother and that, after a considerable amount of discomfort, he asked her to move out. Apparently, it wasn't easy, as it took him quite a while to get her to agree to leave. He knew that once she was settled in, it would be nearly impossible to get her out. I imagine it wasn't a smooth transition knowing her. I would have loved to tell him I told you so, but the truth is I never explicitly said it, because I preferred not to get in the middle of his relationship with his mother. All I know is that she no longer lives with him. I don't know where she is and I have no interest in finding out because I didn't ask. Frankly, I want to know as little as possible about her whereabouts.